health and well-being of older adults from the life course perspective, and particularly the family as a key social institution that influences individual aging. And the title of her presentation is The Effects of Neighborhood Age Segregation on Adult Health. And finally, Dr. Martin Summers is our third presenter. He is an associate professor in the history department and director of the African and African Diaspora Studies program in the College of Arts and Sciences. He is a cultural historian of the 19th and 20th century US with particular research and teaching interests in race, gender, sexuality, and medicine. And the title of his presentation will be The African American Medical Profession and the Politics of Mental Illness, 1895 to 1945. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers.
Thank you, Usha. I welcome you all to the afternoon session. I am going to speak about childhood health disparities and economic disparities, particularly in relation to housing and community contexts. So as I'm sure you're all aware, economic disparities have been growing quite drastically in the United States. So this is a graph that shows the increase in economic disparities since 1967. So in 1967, if you take the entire American population and break them into quartiles, into 5 equal-sized groups, and set their relative economic standing equal, this graph shows how that has shifted over time. So the line at the top, oh, I have my little pointer here. This line is the top 20%, so the top quartile of the American population, and this is actually breaking out the top 5%. So essentially this shows that families at the top of the economic distribution have gotten much better off in the past 2 generations. And the entire bottom 80% of the population has gotten relatively worse off, particularly the bottom 40%. This is particularly an issue for children. So the childhood poverty rate in the United States is drastically larger than it is in any of our comparison economic peers around the world, 3 to 4 to 5 times larger than other countries in the around the world. In the United States, in the most recent year for which we have data, this shows up to 2012, the poverty rate for children under the age of 18 was nearly 22%. So right now, the federal poverty line for a family of 4 is just under $24,000 a year for a family with 2 adults and 2 children. So more than 1 in 5 children live in households with incomes below that. What is also striking about this graph is the huge amount of racial and ethnic disparities in the poverty rate. So the top 2 lines show Black and Hispanic children, and their poverty rates are 3 times higher than the rates for white and Asian American children. So one of my goals in my research is really to understand the contextual factors that either support or inhibit the health and well-being of poor children, to try to drive policy and practice recommendations. So I use to drive my work a basic eco-biodevelopmental model of understanding health and development that basically argues that ecological or contextual factors function in combination with biology to affect human health and development over time. This is a model that's typically used in pediatrics, but I think is increasingly being used by social scientists as well to try to understand how contextual factors can become biologically embedded in humans to drive development over the lifespan. So the work that I'm going to speak about today comes from a long-term project I've been conducting looking at the housing and community contexts of poor children and trying to discern what aspects of housing contexts and community contexts are particularly important for understanding children's health, their physical health, but also the behavioral and emotional health. And again, this work I see as important to help us identify potential policy levers, potential intervention levers to try to improve children's health and well-being. And we might first ask, why is this important to focus particularly on poor children? So we have an incredibly high poverty rate in this country, but what does that really mean for children's health, mental health and physical health? We know from other research that poor children are about 5 times more likely than non-poor children to be reported to be in poor or fair health during childhood. Poor children are about 60% more likely to have asthma than non-poor children. And when we think about mental health, behavioral health, emotional health, poor children are about 3 times more likely than non-poor children to be diagnosed with a behavioral disorder, and 1 to 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with an emotional health disorder. So significant disparities related to economic well-being for children. So let's turn to the issue of housing for families. The United States clearly does not have housing problems that third world countries have. Nearly all Americans live in homes, and nearly all Americans live in homes with such basic things as running water. But nonetheless, there is a significant problem in housing quality for poor families. 83% of poor families in the United States, according to national data, live in homes with at least one primary maintenance or safety problem. So that means things like living with cockroaches or rodents, living with housing with lead paint, living with houses where there's exposed electrical wire, things like that that we know are related to children's health. In addition, 12% of poor families live in housing that's considered really physically inadequate, so that poses a clear problem for children's health and well-being. These are 2 pictures that actually come from a recent legal case that I was a consultant on, where the landlord was being sued because 4 of the 5 children in the family had developed diagnosed neurological disorders that were claimed to be related to the quality of their housing, with excessive levels of cockroaches, of rodents, of lead paint, and a variety of other ills that you can see. A lack of screens, a lack of windows, a lack of a refrigerator, and the case was actually solved for the tenants. So another issue in addition to housing quality is the affordability of housing. So the federal government has set the rate of 30% as sort of an acceptable level of paying for housing. So that means they argue that families should be able to afford to spend 30% of their total income on housing costs. And if they're spending more than that, that's considered unaffordable. And if they're spending more than 50%, then that's considered sort of grossly unaffordable. So when we look at poor families in the United States, we see again that the vast majority, 83% of poor families in the United States spend more than 30% of their income on housing. And almost 2/3, 63%, spend more than 50% of their income on housing. So clearly the federal government, as well as state and local governments, put a lot of resources into trying to help poor families afford decent quality housing. But we also know that only 1 in 4 families that are eligible for housing subsidies from the state or federal government actually receive that assistance. So clearly the funding that's put into those programs are very inadequate to meet the need that is out there in society. So in starting this project, we first started looking at what does the extant research say? What do we really know from the research base about how housing is related to children's health and well-being? We heard earlier today about the negative effects of lead paint. There are very, very clear research evidence that lead paint is linked with cognitive deficits in children. We also have very strong evidence that things like cockroaches and rodents are linked with heightened rates of asthma among children. And there's also a growing literature that looks at sort of more global aspects of chaos. So living in households that have high levels of noise, of crowdedness, of instability, that those factors are linked with both cognitive and behavioral deficits for children. But generally speaking, this research base is very thin. We know very little about the effects of housing costs on children, whether paying a high level of your income on housing is detrimental for children's health and well-being. We know very little about the role of residential mobility of children who move very often. And we know very little about how the quality and the context of housing, which is embedded in the context of neighborhoods, how those things interrelate. And finally, we know very little about adolescence. The majority of work on housing has primarily focused on young children. So in this research, I've used a variety of different data sets to assess how characteristics of housing and of communities are associated with children's health. We've looked at a variety of characteristics of housing. Housing disorder, which contains things like living in housing with cockroaches, with rodents, with a lack of electricity, with lead paint. We've also looked at the cost of housing. We've looked at residential instability, how often families move. We've looked at whether families live in owned housing or rented housing or subsidized housing. And of all of these housing factors, and the cost of housing, of all of these housing factors, our results clearly suggest that housing disorder, that poor quality housing, is the strongest factor associated with children's health. And that children who live in poor quality housing have significantly higher levels of both emotional health problems and behavioral health problems. And this is true both for young children and through adolescence. We've also found that poor quality housing or housing disorder is predictive of a heightened level of developmental delays among infants and toddlers, and also a lower level of physical health and well-being among children. Another factor that we've looked at is trying to understand sort of the processes through which this occur. So one possibility is, coming from the bioecological model, is that the stress from housing or the physical insults from housing are directly biologically embedded in children's neurology, which in turn drives emotional functioning, behavioral functioning. But another possibility is that these results are really driven through other environmental factors. And what our research suggests is that there's evidence for both of these, that some of these associations between poor quality housing and children's lower health outcomes are driven by their parents' responses to poor quality housing. So just like children respond with greater stress, with poorer behaviors when they live in housing that lacks heat, that lacks electricity, that has these physical insults, parents respond that way as well. So living in poor quality housing is associated with higher mental health problems for parents, which in turn is transmitted to lower health for children. So we've also found some other factors of housing that are particularly important for children's health. Firstly, we found that poor quality housing tends to co-occur or bundle with poor quality neighborhoods. So low-income families often can only afford housing that's in disrepair, but they also often can only afford housing that's in low-quality neighborhoods, meaning neighborhoods with high levels of crime, with high levels of social disorder, where families have very little trust and knowledge of each other, where there's limited resources like high-quality schools, neighborhoods, safe parks, and places to play, that these things tend to co-occur and synergistically interrupt children's healthy development. Secondly, we found that housing costs, so people have suggested that paying a lot for housing would be detrimental for children, because if you put a lot of your income into housing, obviously that leaves less left over to purchase food, to purchase clothing, to purchase other important necessities for children. But we also hypothesized that housing costs, paying more for housing, might be beneficial. And we found this, in fact, to be the case, that paying more for housing buys better quality, right? So the more money you put into housing for low-income families, so this is within a certain economic strata, the more likely they are to be able to buy, whether they're renting or purchasing, better quality housing in better quality neighborhoods. And this in turn is helpful for supporting children's development. But nonetheless, the total effect is neutral, because paying more for housing is leaving less left over for other things. Thirdly, we found that residential instability is an important predictor of children's health and development. So children who move more often are more likely to show emotional problems, conduct problems. They're less likely to have strong friendships and be able to get along with their peers. And this, interestingly, is one aspect of housing that's really more universal. So we found this to be the case for children in poor families, but similarly for children in middle-class and upper-class families. This is one aspect of housing that really seems to be more of a universal problem for children's healthy development. And finally, we have found that this broader chaos, so as I mentioned before, poor quality housing often co-occurs with other aspects of the environment. And what we found is that low-income families, poor families that live in housing with a lot of structural and maintenance deficits, also are likely to suffer from other types of instability and chaos in their lives, from more experiences of marital disruptions, from more experiences of residential instability, from poor quality housing, and from poor quality neighborhoods. and that these factors all act synergistically to particularly interrupt healthy development among children. So what does this all mean for policy? I think one of the take-home messages of this work is that we really need to take a broader conceptualization of affordable housing. So much of the federal and state and local policy focus on housing is to help poor families afford housing, to provide subsidies. I think we really need to broaden this to focus more on the maintenance and the quality of housing that poor families can purchase, and to identify policy levers that can help families to continue to maintain and to push the landlords and the people providing housing to continue to maintain the quality of the housing context for children. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sarah Mormon. I'm from the Department of Sociology in the College of Arts and Sciences. And as I was introduced before, my presentation is going to be about the effects of neighborhood age segregation on adult health. So this matches quite nicely with what Professor Coley just presented. Now, sociologists typically study disparity or inequality in health on the basis of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or gender. And in this project, I do something a little bit different. I look at health disparity by age. Age is really a lesser addressed category because unlike categories such as race and gender, people move through age groups over time. And certainly, although older people are a vulnerable population, most people prefer being old to the alternative. So age segregation, I'm using the term in the sense of isolation or separation, and specifically an isolation or separation that limits opportunities and access to resources. And so we do give it a negative connotation in addition to the simple meaning of separation. And theorists have talked about three different types of age segregation. One is institutional age segregation, where age is a criterion for admittance. So you have to be a certain age in order to enter kindergarten. You have to be a certain age in order to begin receiving your Social Security benefits. Those are examples of institutional age segregation. The second, and the one I'll be focusing most on today, is spatial age segregation, or age is a determinant of where people spend their time. Age is a determinant of physical location. So for instance, on a campus like this one, you see relatively few older persons. And you can also think about spatial age segregation as something that happens over the course of a day. So if you think about a place like the grocery store, and you think about the people who go to the grocery store at 9 a.m. versus the people who go to the grocery store at 6 p.m., you can think that those are very different groups of people age-wise. And the third kind of age segregation is cultural age segregation, where age serves as a marker of lifestyle. So here you can think about manner of dress, preference in music, preference in entertainment, preference in food, etc., that serves to separate generations. Theoretically, the age integration literature says that age integration, or the absence of segregation on the basis of institutions, cultures, and spaces, is good for the health of older people, younger people, and everybody in between. The two ideas behind this work are that integration leads to positive interaction. So if you are integrated with people of other ages, you'll have interactions with those people and they will be good for you. And those good interactions will benefit your health. That's what it says theoretically. And so I took this for granted until I went to work on a syllabus for my class on social gerontology. When I looked to see, okay, I'm going to assign this theoretical literature, what's there in the empirical literature? Empty space. And so I decided that I was going to do something about that myself. And Boston College generously gave me a large grant to begin to do that work through our Institute on Aging here. So the first thing I did was look for existing data. And there's some European data on age segregation within people's personal social networks. There's nothing in the United States, there's not a single major survey in the United States that asks about the age of the people in your social network. What we do have is administrative data on spatial age segregation, namely the census. So Census 2010, April 1st of 2010, every American household received a questionnaire that included 10 questions on every member of the household, including date of birth. And these data are aggregated to various geographic levels. The level I'm going to pay attention to now is a census tract, which is what researchers most commonly use to represent in studies as a neighborhood. A census tract is a subdivision of a county. Census tracts never cross county lines, and it's intended to be homogeneous with respect to the demographic characteristics, the socioeconomic status, and the living conditions of the persons who live therein. And census tracts are supposed to contain, on average, 4,000 residents. So, this is the Chestnut Hill Census Tract, and you'll note that it includes, where's my pointer? Up there where the good old ComAv bus goes, up there student residences up here. The residences of Evergreen Cemetery don't count towards the 4,000. You get the reservoir, Chestnut Hill, and the people who live along here, and about maybe a little less than half of main campus. So I know that there's the line here is the Boston-Newton line, which I believe is also a county line. Correct me if I'm wrong. But as I said, census tracts don't cross counties, so the census tract ends kind of in the middle of campus. Right now, we're in the Chestnut Hill Census Tract. If you go up the hill, I think kind of the top of the $1 million staircase, you're outside of it. And so I did some mapping with the assistance of Barbara Mento. Are you out there? Barbara Mento was here earlier, and she helped us with this mapping. I want to mention that these maps are not to scale. I just showed you the size of a census tract, and now I'm putting those census tracts, there's 72,000 of them in the US, I'm putting them on a US map. So this is just intended to give you an idea of where these census tracts are located, but the dots are way, way, way too big for what they should be. And other people's work, not my own, but other people's work has shown that age segregation in neighborhoods is comparable in scope to neighborhood segregation of Hispanic persons. And so, as I'm sure that you're aware, that there's a high level of segregation on the basis of Hispanicity. This is similar. In this prior study, people found that at the county level, 43% of residents would need to move neighborhoods or cross census tracts in order to evenly distribute people on the basis of age. So, high level of age segregation in our communities. So the work that's mine, that's up here, is you'll see a very few red dots, there's only 88 up there, if you can pick them out. And those are the 88 neighborhoods within the United States in 2010 that were within plus or minus 1% of the lower 48 United States age distribution for all age groups. So those are age representative neighborhoods, only 88. There's more blue dots. The blue dots represent census tracts that are plus or minus 2% of the proportion of all age groups relative to the age distribution of the lower 48 United States. We also mapped some extremely age segregated tracts. And these are ones where 75% or more of the roughly 4,000 residents in the tract belong to one particular age group. So we've got 3 up there. The red ones, such as you see kind of around here and in the Midwest, are 75% or more aged 18 to 24. So pick your favorite major college football team and you're probably going to find, so you've got Morgantown, West Virginia, you've got State College, Pennsylvania, and other places there that are basically major college towns. The blue dots are heavily concentrated family neighborhoods. And so families are, or I'm defining families as residences or census tracts that are people aged 30 to 49 and people aged under 18, so parents and kids. And finally, the green dots, which you see some along the Florida coast, some in Arizona, some in Southern California, those are the the older people, those are age 60 and over, populations, neighborhoods that are that larger percent of older persons. So the question is, how does that matter for health? I've described it, so what? Census doesn't ask about health. In order to know something about health, I needed to geomatch the census data to a nationally representative survey, which I used the 2006 National Longitudinal Survey of Midlife in the United States, which asked 4,017 people who lived within 3,714 neighborhoods. These people are aged 30 to 84, and they reported on health. First, they reported on psychological well-being, which is a 43-item scale that asks questions about autonomy, environmental mastery, personal growth, positive relationships with others, purpose in life, self-acceptance. So this is a really positive scale. And self-rated health is a single-item measure, but that runs from it says basically how good is your health, excellent, very good, good, fair, poor. This is a single-item measure, but it's better at predicting mortality than a number of objective measures, including doctor's diagnosis. And what I found was that for psychological well-being, neighborhoods that overrepresent families are the worst for health. And for self-reported health, neighborhoods that overrepresent families are the worst. And by by overrepresent, I mean 5% greater than the national figure, which is 51%. Most neighborhoods are family neighborhoods. So we're talking about a neighborhood in which 56% or more of the residents are aged 30 to 49 and minor children. We found that this was true for people of all ages. So it doesn't matter if you're a family-aged person in a family neighborhood or a centenarian in a family neighborhood, your health is going to suffer. This is true regardless of individual level and neighborhood level socioeconomic status. So it's not just that family neighborhoods are poorer neighborhoods or that they are ethnically or racially segregated. And in addition, this is true even though predominantly older neighborhoods are comprised of people in poorer health in the first place. So it's more than just a compositional effect. So why? And the answer to why, at least so far as I've found, is because of the nature of interactions that people have with their neighbors in various types of neighborhoods. So remember, we've got the neighborhood typology on the one side and we've got health on the other. If you're interested in the neighborhood typology, take a look at Jeff Stokes' poster over there in the back. He's my graduate student and he did a bunch of this work with me. And so what we're thinking of as the mediators, the types of interactions that people have in there, are generativity, daily discrimination, and social cohesion. Generativity is an idea within the gerontological literature that says that older people in particular do well when they have opportunities to mentor and to teach. And we think that it's certainly possible that if you live in a neighborhood that's all old people, you don't have opportunities for generativity, so that can benefit your health. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that living all with younger people's all great, good things all the time either. There's this idea of daily discrimination or microaggressions, where it may be that you have these great generative interactions with younger people, or it may be that what happens is that you go to the corner store and people treat you with disrespect and they ignore you and they talk down to you, and you come away from that interaction feeling quite badly. And finally, there's the idea of social cohesion, or of community trust and community feeling. So we found that these three things mediate the relationship between neighborhoods and health. But why is it that it's family neighborhoods rather than representative neighborhoods, which was where the theory pointed me in the first place? One thing is that representative neighborhoods are diverse in other ways. So gentrification and other kinds of processes make representative neighborhoods ones in which old and young are demographically different, which can either isolate elders or in other cases may draw them into neighbors who have stronger or different kinship norms than the people from their own race, class, or socioeconomic status. And the second is, why is family bad? And this, I think, is a distinction between social cohesion and social enmeshment. Certainly you're familiar with the saying that good fences make good neighbors. And I think that what happens a lot of times in family neighborhoods is that people are too close. They spend all their time together at school, they spend all their time together at the PTA and soccer and ballet, and they know every detail of each other's lives all the time. So finally, just briefly, my work has some implications for theory, practice, and policy. For theory, there's the original question I began with. Is it really true that spatial age segregation is bad for health, or is it in some contexts actually good? A second question is one for practice. Could interventions alter the types of interactions that people have in their neighborhoods, reduce the number that include microaggressions or daily discrimination, and increase the interactions that increase social cohesion and generativity? And the final one is for policy, is that should public health work to promote what we call aging in place, that is to say, aging in the neighborhood that you've spent your entire adult life in, or should it focus on aging in designed retirement communities that can effectively and efficiently deliver things like health services, but on the other hand have an absence of younger people? And I'll pass it on to Martin Summers.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank Tom Childs for inviting me to participate in this inaugural research seminar and putting me on this panel with these scholars who are doing wonderful work with policy implications. I'm going to take this discussion of disparities in a somewhat different direction, and you'll probably notice that one of these things is not like the other. The title of my presentation is The African American Medical Profession and the Politics of Mental Illness, and this really emerges out of my larger research project that I've been working on for a couple of years on race and mental illness in the 19th and 20th century U.S. And specifically, I've been working on a history of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which is a federal mental institution in Washington, D.C., and the relationship between that institution and the African American community in the nation's capital. And one of the central questions that I attempt to address in this work is what is the role of, or what was the role of ideas about racial difference in the production of psychiatric knowledge, and how the psychiatric profession actually understood or came to understand what constituted insanity, and then how did that translate into the management of black bodies in this particular institution. Now, anyone who has read any of the medical literature in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and specifically looked at how physicians talked about race, and particularly African Americans, is really struck at the proliferation of a racial degeneracy discourse that was present in the medical literature. And that is this idea, physicians really pointed to purported increases in the rates of particular illnesses, specifically tuberculosis and syphilis, as evidence that African Americans could not exist in society as free people. And in fact, these rising rates of morbidity and mortality portended the race's imminent extinction. And if you look at some, I've just pulled two the headlines from representative articles to this effect. One by J.F. Miller, who was superintendent of Eastern Hospital in North Carolina, which was founded specifically to house and treat African Americans in North Carolina after the Civil War. And he published in 1896 an article titled "The Effects of Emancipation Upon the Mental and Physical Health of the Negro of the South." 4 years later, J. Allison Hodges, a professor of nervous and mental diseases in Virginia, published an article very similar to that, "The Effect of Freedom Upon the Physical and Psychological Development of the Negro." And these are just two examples, probably scores of articles along these lines. And I've just pulled one quote from Miller, and give you a sense of the discourse and the narrative that was being produced about African Americans, and particularly these rising rates of illness, including insanity. And J.F. Miller writes, "In his ignorance of the laws of his being, the functions of citizenship, and the responsibilities and duties which freedom imposed, demands were made upon the Negro which his intellectual parts were unable to discharge. In his former condition, none of these things disturbed his mind." Now, This was the kind of literature that was being produced around the turn of the 20th century as African Americans were increasingly being segregated and disfranchised in the South. And so in many ways, this medical literature, if not direct, was certainly tacit support for those political projects in the South. But this kind of narrative persisted within the medical profession and the psychiatric profession, which you'll see in this article published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in July of 1921 by W.M. Beavis, who happened to be a psychiatrist on the staff of St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., in which he writes, "Less than 300 years ago, the alien ancestors of most of the families of this race were savages or cannibals in the jungles of Central Africa. From this very primitive level, they were unwittingly brought to these shores and into an environment of higher civilization for which the biological development of the race had not made adequate preparation. In later years, citizenship with its novel privileges, possibly a greater transition than the first, was thrust upon the race, finding it poorly prepared intellectually for adjustment to this new social order." So this increasing belief that African Americans were now predisposed to mental illness was actually a very different way of thinking about the relationship between race and mental illness that existed prior to emancipation, in which psychiatrists and physicians believed that African Americans as quote-unquote primitive peoples were relatively immune to mental illness, largely because their brains and nervous systems weren't sufficiently developed to experience deterioration to begin with. But after emancipation, by the late 19th, early 20th century, you have a very different narrative about African Americans' propensity to mental illness. And as I was looking at this literature, I was curious about how and if the African American medical profession was responding to this narrative. And I was somewhat surprised to see that they, even as black physicians refuted charges that high rates of tuberculosis and syphilis were evidence of black inferiority, they rarely addressed the issue of insanity. And I was curious as to why that was the case. What did this mean as far as the African American medical profession's relationship to mental illness and mental health as a whole? And a corollary question to that was, what did this mean for lay African Americans' relationship to psychiatry, which has been characterized by a history of underutilization of non-institutional mental health services that persists up through the present moment. And after doing research in the medical literature that was produced by the black medical profession, and looking at some medical school records, what I found was that the black medical profession was essentially a generation behind the mainstream, i.e. white medical profession, in terms of developing a robust institutional and organizational network that was aimed at addressing mental health in the black community. So whereas you see the development of this institutional and organizational infrastructure within the white medical profession around the turn of the 20th century, and perhaps even later, as early as the 1880s, you really don't begin to see the development of a similar infrastructure within the black medical profession until the interwar period, and particularly the 1930s and the 1940s. And so the question became why? Well, there are a couple of factors, some of which are structural and some of which are cultural. One is the time lag in the professionalization of African American physicians. Whereas the white medical profession or white physicians had professionalized by the mid-19th century, 1847 to be exact, with the formation of the American Medical Association, which excluded people of color as well as women. Black physicians don't professionalize until 1895 with the formation of the National Medical Association, and they don't begin producing a journal until 1909, some 15 years later. Other structural factors included the obstacles that stood in the way of African Americans actually specializing in psychiatric education. The medical schools that educated African Americans did not have psychiatry departments. For instance, Howard University in Washington, D.C., Meharry Medical College in Nashville don't develop psychiatry departments until the 1930s and the 1960s, respectively. And most of the other medical schools in the U.S. that were training psychiatrists in the early 20th century excluded African Americans. There were some exceptions, but nonetheless, for the most part, there just wasn't the development of a black psychiatric profession in the early 20th century. Another a reason for this, or a factor, was cultural, and that is a general resistance to mental health services or psychiatry within the African American population. And this has been explained as recently as 1999 with the U.S. Surgeon General's report, as a result of a skepticism towards psychiatry and a skepticism towards medicine in general among African Americans, and particularly kind of a distrust of the medical profession, in addition to a reliance on the church as a resource for dealing with emotional problems and stress. And this isn't unique to African Americans. This is characteristic of the South as a region in general through at least the first half of the 20th century. Of course, most of the African Americans in this country lived in the South through the first half of the 20th century. But what I found also in my research is that there was a set of ideological and political factors that aren't necessarily divorced from structure and culture, but that can't be reduced to them either. So if we think about when the black physicians began to professionalize around the turn of the 20th century, at the time, the state of knowledge about mental illness, there was a lack of consensus as to what actually caused mental illness. Was it somatic-based? If so, what were the physiological causes? Was it a product of the accumulation of an individual's life experiences? On the one hand, you had psychiatrists who were trained in neurology who were making an argument that mental illness was the result of organic damage to the brain or the nervous system. On the other hand, you had psychiatrists who were arguing that mental illness was the maladaptation of an individual to his or her social environment, and these were known as dynamic psychiatrists. So at the same time that you have this non-consensus over as to the etiology of mental illness, black healthcare professionals were confronting high rates of morbidity and mortality in black communities that were actually the result of somatic diseases such as tuberculosis, syphilis, pneumonia, vitamin deficiency disorders such as pellagra. And while racial degeneracy theorists attributed these, again, rising rates of illness to African Americans' biological predisposition, black physicians attributed it to environmental factors such as, I'm going to skip that, such as poor conditions in African American neighborhoods. And these are just a couple of scenes from kind of alley life in Washington, D.C. So it's not only that tuberculosis, right, and other infectious diseases posed a real threat to African American communities, but it allowed black physicians and healthcare workers to actually expose the physical trauma of racism. In other words, high rates of infectious diseases and vitamin deficiency disorders became an index for African Americans' lack of full citizenship rights. And I think this is really captured in the presidential address of Dr. A.M. Brown for the National Medical Association in 1914, in which he writes, "It is then proper to direct energy toward the removal of all causes over which he has no control and to which his civic life is amenable, namely the disregard for his domestic environments, his insanitary homes, his lack of sewer hygiene, his poverty, his low wages, his destitution, his privation, his lack of employment, his ignored rights in railway stations and depots, and his poor accommodations with regard to street railway stations and railway privileges. It is time for the profession to appeal in the Negro's behalf to the national government for the protection of this class of humanity in the form of conservation funds. So in other words, black healthcare professionals and activists could make direct linkages between environment, behavior, and disease etiology, then use those linkages to advocate for better economic opportunities and end to segregation and federal investment in the black public health infrastructure. And I'm getting ready to wrap up here. This indeterminacy around the causes of mental illnesses gave black physicians less political purchase. And so the connection between disease and citizenship really becomes illustrated when you begin to see the return of African American veterans with neuropsychiatric problems. And it is at this point that you begin to see an increased attention within the black medical profession towards issues or the existence of mental illness. But the relationship between citizenship and disease functions very differently, whereas somatic diseases were an indication of African Americans' lack of full citizenship. War neuroses that are being exhibited among black veterans are an example of African Americans' capacity for citizenship, and it really brings to the fore the national hypocrisy of allowing these men to go off and fulfill the highest duty of citizenship and not extending civil rights to African Americans in general. But nonetheless, you begin to see more discussion of mental illness, but that mental illness still focuses on the somatic nature of insanity and so there's really no development of resources that might address African Americans who are suffering from functional mental illnesses or mental illnesses that don't have any clear somatic origin. And you really don't begin to see the development of those resources until the 1940s. So in conclusion, one of the far-reaching conclusions that I've made, or I'm able to draw through my research, is that African American physicians' ambivalent relationship to mental illness in the early 20th century was one of the factors that contributed to a lack of tradition of seeking psychotherapy within the black community. And it really complicates our understanding of the racial disparity in the seeking and provision of mental health services in the contemporary US, which has largely been explained by, again, African Americans' cultural resistance to psychiatry, whereas I'm arguing that it's really a function, or it's equally a function of a prioritization within the black mental profession that was shaped by African Americans' precarious status as citizenship.
I just want to thank our wonderful speakers. We've heard from a historical perspective, but it's amazing to me that how contemporary those issues are today, as contemporary as the ones that were presented earlier in the panel. So now is the time that we open it up for questions. So we do have microphones traveling across the room, so please do ask your questions.
My question may not relate to any of the panel discussions or the presentations of the panel. It's a plea to look into the situation of the immigrants, the refugees in particular, from the wars and from the internal displacements that have come here, whether it is starting with Bosnia or Somalia or Iraq or right now Syria. If that is possible for you to look into those and then in your research later on. Thank you.
That's a great suggestion. I think one of the challenges is that there's very limited data available on new groups to the United States such as that. I think that studies on those populations often have to collect their own data and build their own connections to those populations and communities to be able to access the populations to study, so that the kind of work that we do looking at big national data sets, it's very difficult to find information on those populations. But I think that's a very important point.
Question for Dr. Summers. I thought that was a very interesting talk, and I might have my history wrong, but I think that there's probably some overlap in time with the events you're talking about in the eugenics movement.
The what?
Eugenics movement in this country.
Mm.
Things like planned or forced sterilization.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be very curious to see if taking the same angle, if you could find the opinions of the black medical community on the eugenics movement, because I would think there'd be some overlap between that and mental health.
There is, and perhaps overlap in a way that you wouldn't think, but actually there was a segment within the black profession that actually did advocate eugenics, the black medical profession that advocated eugenics, largely because they were as captive of a dominant cultural ideas about race progress, right? And how are we actually going to get our race into a position where we can actually assimilate into mainstream society, so that we have to actually breed the best that we can. There's this idea that lower class blacks are breeding too much. The more educated African Americans are not, and you see this. You not only see this among black physicians, but you see some variation of this in, say, W.B. Du Bois's discussion of the talented 10th. You see this in some literature, black-produced literature in the 1920s during the Harlem Renaissance.
I think this is for Professor Mormon. You left us with some tantalizing questions at the end, whether aging in place is going to be better for senior citizens and better for communities, or whether having age segregation is a better way to provide support services. So those are really interesting questions, and I know that went beyond your 15 minutes, but is there some innovative work that you know of being done on that side of what makes a better community?
There is. I think most of it has been around organized retirement communities and the ways that you can make those less institutional and more supportive than it has been around naturally occurring communities. There's, for instance, the greenhouse movement, which is not referring to glass houses, but is referring to residences that have where older people have access to, children, animals, and plants. And that when those components are in place, quality of life is much better. And so organizations where you can take maybe a traditional nursing home and locate it near a daycare, and have those two communities come together. Or in some cases, and there's some really beautiful ones in Boston, where the institution is built as a house, and it's a big universally accessible house that has 8 to 10 residents, but it has a hearth, it has people who cook, it has house plants, it has house animals. And so while people are in a safe and institutionalized to the extent that they have regular medical care setting, it's also a very home-like setting, and there's been a lot of work done on that kind of thing.
More questions? We have a couple more minutes.
Both of the housing research, I think both mentioned something about legislation, and I was curious if there's any focus on doing maybe more grassroots community organizing, and if that can have a positive impact on health in either the age disparity or in the certain environmental factors.
So one grassroots thing that has happened among older adults is the NORC, naturally occurring retirement community, where people who have lived in a neighborhood for a long time get together, they form a nonprofit, and they bring in their own services. And these are communities in which people of other ages can live, but they also have access to, the things that you would get in a nursing home or an assisted living or in an independent retirement community. The limitation to those is it's almost always rich white folks who come up with these NORCs and can get it together. And so those are people who would have done fine anywhere anyway. But it is a really cool model.
I think
generally in the housing quality and housing affordability world, there's a lot of both NGOs and community organizations, and as well as slightly less structured groups working on these issues in the United States and abroad as well. There are certainly many local efforts in Boston and local NGOs in Boston and other cities in the United States, obviously, who are working to improve the quality of housing and the accessibility and availability of affordable housing for poor families.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one. Okay, I actually have a question. So I will pose the question to Dr. Summers. And I wonder if you can say anything about the intersection of medical experimentation on African Americans in the 20th century and the impact of that on the profession's approach to mental illness or physical illness. Yeah.
So the profession's approach, and not the African American community's approach to mental illness.
Either or both, yeah.
I think I could speak a little more to the African American community's response to mental illness, not mental illness so much as mental health services, right? So there has historically been a mistrust of the medical profession within the African American community that goes back to the 19th century, right, with the unauthorized use of black bodies for dissection, for medical education, and those things. And of course, we see various forms of experimentation also contributing to that. Probably the most familiar one is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And so that, again, has been one of the reasons that has been used to explain why African Americans tend to underutilize outpatient mental health services. And there's been established certainly a correlative, if not a causative relationship or causal relationship between the failure to seek mental health services very early on, and then the duration of institutionalization, right? If you don't begin to address mental health issues early, then you're more likely to end up institutionalized for a much longer time, and that's certainly been a dynamic within the African American community. But one of the things that I've tried to do with this research is take that seriously and acknowledge that, but also I think there's been a tendency, for instance, to just take that as the only reasons, right, or to put too much emphasis on this cultural skepticism of psychiatry, and not acknowledge that there were real kind of political reasons that the African American medical profession did not take up psychiatry to the same extent as the white medical profession did. And again, it's tied very much to this issue of citizenship.
Thank you. I want to thank our panel and all of you for being here. So we're going to have a short break, 15 minutes. We'll resume at 4:30. And